The Ithric Empire cast a long shadow over the galaxy. No species had ever stood against them for more than a few years, and those who tried were erased from history. Their cities turned to ash, and their people made slaves, or worse. Whispered rumors of their power spread like wildfire through the stars. Ships too powerful for any fleet to fight entire civilizations bent the knee to the Ithrak, unwilling to meet their fate in battle when it seemed clear that resistance was futile. Yet even among the stars, there remained whispers of something greater, something that had not yet been tested. Humanity had only just begun to stretch its wings in the vastness of space. They had explored a few nearby systems and created colonies that dotted the edge of their solar system, but they had never once come into contact with the Ithrak Empire. That was until now the Ithrak had turned their eyes to Earth. The humans had been blissfully unaware that they were the next target. The Ithrak had other priorities in the galaxy, but their scouts had found the humans growing stronger and more curious about the stars. As they began to experiment with faster-than-light travel, the time had come to make them submit. A fleet of Ithrak warships was dispatched to Earth. Its command ship, an enormous structure that could blot out the sun and lay waste to entire cities. Its weapons could obliterate entire fleets in seconds. The humans had no idea the storm that was about to hit, but they would soon learn. Earth's leaders gathered in secret councils, the magnitude of the situation finally sinking in. They had no hope of fighting the Ithrak directly. Their military was still in its infancy, their weapons primitive compared to the Ithrak's unimaginable power. But one man, General Dominic Riker, refused to accept that humanity's story would end here. He had spent years studying military history and had learned one undeniable truth: never underestimate a species that fights for survival. Humanity was a stubborn species born of centuries of war and resilience against adversity. It had endured the darkest moments of its own history and emerged stronger each time. Riker believed this was humanity's greatest strength, and that strength was about to be tested in ways no one could predict. Riker proposed a radical idea, a last-ditch effort to defend humanity, a single warship capable of confronting the Ithrak. No one else had the courage to even suggest such an idea. They were simply too outmatched, too outgunned. But Riker pushed forward his vision, a warship built with the most advanced human technology, paired with daring tactics that no other species would dare to employ. This ship would be Earth's response. It would be humanity's first and only line of defense. The world watched as this colossal project took shape inside a hidden facility, tucked away in a remote corner of Earth's moon. It was a ship unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen, a marvel of human ingenuity, designed by the best engineers, scientists, and military minds of the era. The ship was christened the Resolute, and it would carry the hopes and dreams of humanity on its shoulders. Its mission was clear: get to the heart of Ithrak space and either defeat them or die trying. Riker had no illusions about the odds, but he also knew the potential of this ship and its crew. They would not go down without a fight, and the Ithrak would learn the true power of humanity. The day came when the Resolute was ready to launch, and Captain Kara Monroe stood on the bridge of the colossal warship, staring at the view of Earth shrinking behind her. The weight of what she was about to do settled heavily on her shoulders. This was not just a military mission, it was humanity's stand against extinction. She had always been a strategist, a leader who knew how to keep her crew calm in the most dire of circumstances. But this was different. The Resolute was the only ship they had, the only chance, and it was leaving Earth's atmosphere to confront an empire that had crushed every species that had dared to resist. The humans had poured everything they had into this ship, from advanced weaponry to untested propulsion systems. The ship was a gamble in every sense of the word, but it was humanity's best shot at survival. Captain Monroe had been chosen for this mission, not because she was the most experienced with combat, but because she understood what was at stake. She had grown up in the shadow of war and had seen the strength of humanity's resolve firsthand. She was unshakable in her belief that humanity had something the Ithrak didn't, something that couldn't be measured by firepower or advanced technology. The human spirit was capable of overcoming the impossible. As the Resolute ascended through Earth's atmosphere, she couldn't help but look at the faces of her crew. They were the best and brightest humanity had to offer, But they were also scared. Some were too young to truly understand the full gravity of the mission. Others were veterans of the wars on Earth and had seen the cost of failure firsthand. They were a diverse group from every corner of the planet, united by one purpose: to protect their home, and if necessary to sacrifice themselves for the future of humankind. Among them was Lieutenant Noah Adams, the ship's weapons officer, and one of the few people who believed in the success of the mission from the start. His enthusiasm was infectious, and his strategic mind invaluable. They had spent countless hours testing the ship's weapon systems, trying to make sure they would hold up against the Ythrak's devastating firepower. The crew trusted him, but even he couldn't hide the nervousness that simmered beneath the surface. Lieutenant Colonel Amina Kari was the ship's chief tactical officer. She had trained for years to defend humanity from any external threat, but the Ythrak were a different kind of enemy. They had no known weaknesses, no fear. Their technology had made them virtually unstoppable. But Amina believed that every enemy had a flaw. If one could be found, it was just a matter of time before they found it. The crew worked tirelessly for days at a time, preparing for the inevitable encounter with the Ythrak. They knew their chances of survival were slim, but that did not deter them. They had a singular focus. The Ythrak would be stopped at all costs. As the Resolute traveled through deep space, they crossed into territories that were not only uncharted, but also filled with dangers of their own. Distant stars and asteroid fields that tested the limits of their navigation systems. Every new challenge was an opportunity for the crew to come together and adapt. The ship was still untested in real combat conditions, and every system was put under intense pressure, but it held together. Captain Monroe knew that they would face worse obstacles when they entered Ythrak space. They would need to be ready for anything. As the crew continued their journey into the unknown, they began to understand what it meant to fight for survival. The mission was no longer just about fighting an alien empire. It was about the future of every human being on Earth. Their courage, their sacrifices, would define the legacy of humanity in the stars. And as they neared the Ythrak borders, Captain Monroe felt something shift inside her. It wasn't just fear, it was determination, a force stronger than any weapon that could be aimed at them. The universe would soon know that humanity had come to the stars not to conquer but to survive, and to fight for their place in the galaxy. The journey into Ythrak space was harder than anyone had expected. The Resolute was built to withstand the worst the galaxy had to offer. But the unknowns of deep space were proving more dangerous than the crew had prepared for. As they moved farther from Earth, the familiar became the unfamiliar. Space itself seemed to shift in ways that made even the most seasoned officers uneasy. For the first time, Captain Monroe allowed herself to acknowledge the doubt that had been silently creeping into her mind. They had no allies in this part of the galaxy, no one to turn to for help, no way to know what lay ahead. The ship had been equipped with the best technology Earth could offer, but technology alone wouldn't win this fight. It would take more than that. The Resolute was meant to be humanity's last stand. But what if it wasn't enough? What if they weren't enough? As they crossed into the outer borders of Ythrak space, the crew began to sense the enormity of what they were up against. The very air seemed to hum with a quiet threat, as though something was watching them from the darkness. The Ythrak had left their mark on every sector they passed through. Large ships patrolled the space lanes, and vast mining stations loomed like silent sentinels in the distance. The crew watched with a mix of awe and terror at the sheer scale of the empire they had come to face. They had known the Ythrak were ruthless, but seeing it firsthand made the reality even more terrifying. Yet as the crew grew accustomed to the tension of Ythrak space, they also began to learn how to survive. The first lesson came when they were nearly ambushed by a Ythrak scout ship. The ship was fast and agile. Its weapons were powerful enough to overwhelm the Resolute in minutes, but Captain Monroe remained calm. She ordered the crew to engage in evasive maneuvers that utilized the ship's speed and advanced shields in ways they had not practiced before. It was a risky maneuver, but it worked. The Ythrak ship's weapons failed to hit their mark, and the Resolute managed to disable the scout ship without taking any significant damage. The crew erupted into cheers, but Monroe was silent. She knew this was just the beginning. It had been a close call, but it had shown her something crucial: they were capable of adapting on the fly using human ingenuity and determination to overcome challenges that no one had expected them to survive. This wasn't about technology, it was about what they could do with what they had. Lieutenant Adams was the first to speak up after the encounter. "Captain, if we can keep using their overconfidence against them, we might just make it to their capital." Captain Monroe nodded slowly. She knew Adams was right. They had to stay one step ahead of the Ythrak. They couldn't outgun them, but they could outthink them. They could use the Ythrak's own arrogance to their advantage. The battle with the scout ship had proven that they had a fighting chance, but Monroe knew that this was just the beginning. The real test was still ahead. The Resolute pressed on into the heart of Ythrak space, each day bringing them closer to their goal, but also closer to the inevitable confrontation that awaited them. She had seen the fear in her crew's eyes during the brief skirmish, but she also saw something else, a spark of hope that hadn't been there before. As they continued forward, the crew grew stronger in their resolve. They weren't just fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting for something greater, the chance to prove to the galaxy that humanity was not to be underestimated. The tension in the air was palpable as the Resolute continued its journey deeper into Ythrak space. Every decision felt like it could be their last, and with every passing day, the crew knew they were drawing closer to the heart of the enemy's empire. The Ythrak fleet was vast and heavily fortified, but Captain Monroe had been right about one thing: they were underestimating humanity. They had expected to find a weak species, one that would crumble at the first sign of battle, but what they didn't know was that humans had an uncanny ability to survive against all odds, even when the situation seemed hopeless. It was this resilience that kept the crew of the Resolute pushing forward, and just as the pressure was beginning to mount, a surprise event changed the course of their mission. They encountered a distress signal from a ship not of Ythrak origin. It was an alien vessel, crippled and drifting in space. Its hull bore the marks of a battle, but it wasn't the Ythrak who had attacked it. The ship's identification markers revealed it belonged to a species previously unknown to the crew of the Resolute, but the crew recognized something else. The ship was damaged beyond repair, yet the distress signal indicated survivors aboard. Monroe ordered an emergency recovery operation. With no time to waste, the crew launched a boarding party into the unknown wrecked ship. It was dark inside and eerily quiet. As the team made their way through the broken corridors, suddenly a voice echoed through the darkness, speaking in a strange language. It was a language the ship's translators couldn't decode at first, but there was desperation in the voice. It wasn't long before they found the survivors, a small group of aliens injured, but alive. They were members of a species called the Varerasav. Nomads who had been hunted and enslaved by the Ythrak for generations. Their culture had been destroyed in a systematic campaign to eradicate all traces of their people. They spoke of Ythrak atrocities, of entire planets laid to waste by the Empire, and how they had escaped in the hope that one day they would find a species strong enough to fight back against their oppressors. The Var were few in number, but they had knowledge, the kind of knowledge that could turn the tide of war in humanity's favor. The Var had been tracking Ythrak movements for years and had developed methods to sabotage their fleets, though they had never been strong enough to do it alone. Now, with the humans at their side, they believed there was a chance to strike back together. It was a desperate gamble, but it was also a game changer. Monroe knew this was a turning point in their mission. The Resolute was no longer fighting alone. They had allies in this war, ones who knew the Ythrak inside and out, and who were ready to stand and fight as much as the humans were. The Var agreed to share their intelligence on Ythrak tactics and weaknesses in exchange for their freedom. It was an uneasy alliance born of mutual necessity, but it was one that gave both species hope. For the first time in this war, Captain Monroe felt the weight of their mission shift. They weren't just going to survive anymore. They were going to strike back together. With the Var's guidance, the crew of the Resolute was more determined than ever to bring the fight to the heart of the Ythrak Empire. They were no longer outmatched and outgunned. They had something the Ythrak hadn't counted on: unity. The crew trained tirelessly with the Var, teaching them everything they knew about guerrilla tactics, sabotage, and ambushes that would give them an edge in future battles. With this new knowledge and newfound allies, the Resolute was no longer just humanity's last stand. It was the vanguard of a galaxy-wide resistance ready to tear the Ythrak Empire apart from within. The alliance with the Ver had changed everything for the crew of the Resolute. Their once desperate mission now felt like something more like a real chance at victory. They were no longer isolated in enemy territory. They had a network of intelligence from the Ver that opened up new possibilities. The first test of their new strategy came when the crew decided to take on a Ythrak convoy, transporting vital supplies to one of their major military bases. The convoy was heavily guarded by a fleet of warships, but with the Ver's help, the Resolute was able to map out the convoy's route and find a weak point in its formation. Monroe knew this was their moment to strike. The convoy wasn't the ultimate goal, but it was an important step. They needed to prove to themselves that they could win these small battles and gain the confidence they needed to face the Ythrak head-on. Under the cover of darkness, the Resolute positioned itself within the dense asteroid field that lay between the convoy's path and their destination. It was the perfect place to ambush the heavily armored transport ships. The crew had drilled for this moment again and again, using the Ver's tactics of stealth and surprise to overcome the enemy's overwhelming numbers. The moment of truth arrived. The convoy appeared just as predicted, and Monroe gave the order to attack. The Resolute moved in swiftly and without warning, its weapon systems coming to life as it launched a barrage of firepower at the Ythrak ships. The convoy's guards scrambled to respond, but it was too late. The humans were too fast to organize, and they struck hard and fast. Their first shots disabled the lead Ythrak ship in a fiery explosion. As the crew continued to focus their firepower on the enemy, the Ythrak scrambled to regroup, but their response was disjointed and chaotic. The humans had taken them by surprise, and it showed. The battle raged for only a few minutes, but it was enough to secure a clear victory. The Resolute had destroyed half of the Ythrak convoy before the remaining ships had even been able to react. The humans suffered only minor damage to the ship itself, and the convoy's vital supplies were now in their hands. The crew erupted into cheers at the success. The victory was sweet, but Captain Monroe remained focused. She knew this was only one battle in what was sure to be a long war with the Ythrak. Yet for the first time since they entered Ythrak space, Monroe allowed herself a small smile. They had done it. They had proved they could fight back against the Ythrak, and when they had no illusions that this would be the end. But the victory was a sign that humanity had finally found its place in this war. The Ythrak were not invincible, and now the galaxy would know it. Lieutenant Adams was the first to speak up after the battle, his voice filled with pride. "Captain, we're making them bleed. We've got their attention." Monroe nodded and turned to the communications officer, who had already begun broadcasting a message across Ythrak space. It was simple and direct. It spoke of their victory and of the human race's defiance to the Ythrak Empire. "We are humanity. We are not your slaves." It was a message that resonated with countless other species across the galaxy, those who had been oppressed and enslaved by the Ythrak. For so long they had seen what the humans could do, and for the first time in years they saw a glimmer of hope in a galaxy that had been under Ythrak control for far too long. This small victory was just the beginning. It was the spark that would ignite a revolution, a galaxy-wide resistance against the Ythrak Empire that would change the course of history forever. And as the Resolute turned away from the wreckage of the convoy heading deeper into enemy space, the crew felt a renewed sense of purpose. They were no longer just fighting for survival. They were fighting for freedom and for the future of the galaxy. The victory over the Ythrak convoy had sent ripples through the galaxy. It wasn't just a win for the Resolute or for humanity. It was a message, a signal that the Ythrak Empire was not as invincible as they believed. The Resolute had shown that even in the face of overwhelming force, the human spirit could find a way to fight back. The victory emboldened the crew, but it also attracted the attention of the Ythrak. They knew now that humanity wasn't going to lie down and die. They had become a threat to the Empire, and that meant they would be hunted down at all costs. Captain Monroe could feel the shift in the air. The tension that had once been subtle was now unmistakable. They were no longer the underdogs. They were now a symbol of resistance across the galaxy, a beacon of hope to every species who had suffered under Ythrak rule. But that also made them a target. It wasn't long before the Ythrak retaliated. Their response came in the form of a massive assault a fleet of warships, unlike anything the crew of the Resolute had ever seen. It was a force so large it made the earlier battles seem like skirmishes by comparison. Captain Monroe stared at the tactical readouts as the fleet of Ythrak warships appeared on the horizon, their weapons primed, and their intent clear. They were coming to crush the humans once and for all. The Resolute was far from ready for such a force, but Monroe refused to back down. She called her crew to the briefing room, where every officer stood ready for the next step. "This is it," she said, her voice steady, but carrying the weight of everything they had fought for. "We're facing an enemy that outnumbers us and outguns us, but we have something they don't. We have the element of surprise, and we have each other. We've won before. Because we fought smarter, we used their overconfidence against them, and we'll do it again." The crew nodded in unison. The fear was still there, but it was no longer paralyzing. It was a reminder of what was at stake. The ship was ready, the crew was ready, and they had a plan. The Resolute would fight again, and this time they would not be alone. The Vare had sent word that they were joining the fight. Their ship, small and fast, but deadly, would arrive in time to provide backup. They had fought the Ythrak before and knew how to hit them where it hurt. The Vare were not just allies, they were a force that could tip the scales in their favor. Together with their new allies, the Resolute would engage the Ythrak in a battle like no other. The plan was simple: to strike quickly and decisively, to hit the Ythrak fleet where it would hurt the most. Their command ship was the heart of the fleet. If it could be destroyed, the rest of the warships would fall into disarray. That was where the Vare ships would come in. Using their knowledge of Ythrak tactics, they would draw the enemy fleet's attention away from the Resolute, allowing the human ship to get close enough to deliver a crippling blow. Monroe knew the risks, but she also knew that if they didn't act now, the Ythrak would wipe them out before they could even reach the heart of the Empire. Every decision had led to this moment. The crew was ready to make their stand, but as they moved into position, Captain Monroe couldn't shake the feeling that this would be the turning point. They had been fighting for so long, but this battle would decide everything. It would either mark the beginning of the end for the Ythrak Empire, or it would be the last chapter in humanity's brief existence in the stars. The silence on the bridge was deafening. As the Resolute crept closer to the heart of the Ythrak fleet, the entire crew was tense, their eyes fixed on their stations as they moved deeper into enemy territory. This was the moment they had all been waiting for. The plan was in motion, and there was no turning back. Captain Monroe stood at the command center, her eyes scanning the readouts as the Ythrak fleet came into view. It was an imposing sight: massive warships bristling with weapons, a formidable force that could decimate them in an instant. But Monroe didn't flinch. She trusted in her crew and in their strategy. They had one shot to take down the heart of the Ythrak fleet, the command ship. If they failed, everything would be lost, and the galaxy would remain under Ythrak control. The Vare ships had arrived as promised. Their small and nimble craft darted through the chaos of the battle, distracting the Ythrak warships and drawing them away from the Resolute, allowing the humans to get close enough to strike. The first phase of the plan had worked. They were in position. Now came the hardest part. The Resolute began its approach to the command ship. The battle raged around them, with explosions lighting up the darkness of space. The crew moved with precision, every officer knowing their role in this dangerous game. The weapon systems were locked and loaded, and the ship's shields were raised to their maximum strength. The tension was unbearable, but there was no time for fear. They had trained for this moment. The Ythrak ships continued to engage the Vare craft, while the Resolute inched closer to the enemy flagship. Monroe's eyes flicked back to the tactical screen as they approached the heart of the Ythrak fleet. The command ship loomed ahead, a massive vessel that exuded power and menace. It was the key to everything, and if they could take it down, the rest of the fleet would fall into disarray. But the Ythrak weren't going to let them have it without a fight. Suddenly, alarms blared across the bridge. The Ythrak command ship had detected their approach, and its defensive systems were coming online. The moment of truth had arrived. "Prepare for evasive maneuvers," Monroe commanded, her voice cold and steady. "Lock onto the command ship's weak point and fire everything we've got." The crew sprang into action. The weapons officer, Lieutenant Adams, targeted the command ship's vulnerable section, while Amina Kauri, The tactical officer adjusted their positioning to avoid incoming fire. The Resolute shook as enemy fire rocked its shields, but they held strong. The ship groaned under the stress, but the crew's focus never wavered. Adams gave the order, and the Resolute fired its first volley at the Ythrak command ship. The weapons barrage hit its mark with devastating precision. Explosions erupted from the flagship's hull, but the ship was far from defeated. The Ythrak retaliated immediately, their firepower raining down on the human ship. The battle raged in a violent crescendo as the Resolute dodged and weaved through the enemy fire, returning fire with everything they had. But despite their best efforts, the Ythrak were powerful and their flagship was heavily armored. The fight was grueling, and every second felt like an eternity. The crew was pushing the ship to its limits, but they were not backing down. They had come too far to fail now. As the battle continued, Captain Monroe watched with a fierce determination in her eyes. They had made it this far, they had defied the odds, and brought the fight to the heart of the Ythrak Empire. But there was still one last obstacle. The Ythrak command ship was still standing, and the next few moments would decide everything. If they didn't destroy it now, they would lose the opportunity forever, and humanity's last stand would come to an end. The tension on the bridge was unbearable. The crew of the Resolute had pushed the ship to its absolute limits, but the Ythrak command ship was still standing. It was a massive beast of a ship, but it was clear to Captain Monroe that it was beginning to falter. The explosions they had unleashed had caused critical damage, but it was still functioning and still fighting back with every shot fired. The crew of the Resolute knew that they couldn't last much longer if they didn't finish the job. Soon the Ythrak flagship was relentless, and its weapons were tearing into the Resolute's shields. The whole ship shuddered under the assault. The lights flickered, but they held fast. They had come so far, they couldn't lose now. Monroe clenched her fists and spoke in a voice that carried authority and determination. "We're not stopping, not now. We're finishing this." She turned to Lieutenant Adams. "Fire everything. We've got at that weak point. We need to punch through now." Adams didn't hesitate. He locked onto the damaged section of the Ythrak command ship and gave the order to fire. The weapons of the Resolute unleashed a torrent of energy blasts. With everything they had left, the air on the bridge crackled with the power of their attack, and for a brief moment time seemed to slow as the energy beams hit their target. A massive explosion erupted from the command ship's core. The Ythrak ship groaned as its hull cracked and broke apart like a wounded animal. It fought back, but it was clear the end was near. The Ythrak flagship was on its last legs. The remaining warships of the Ythrak fleet tried to regroup, but it was too late. The chaos of the battle had already taken its toll. The Ythrak were disoriented and scattered. The crew of the Resolute pushed forward. The command ship was weakening by the second, and Captain Monroe knew this was their chance. They had to finish what they started. The Resolute weaved in and out of the debris from the fallen Ythrak ships. The crew's eyes never left their target, the command ship. They launched another round of fire at the critical point, and this time the explosion was catastrophic. The entire Ythrak flagship erupted in a blinding flare of light. The shockwave rocked the Resolute, but it held firm. When the light cleared, the command ship was no more. The battle had been won. The Resolute had delivered the final blow, and the Ythrak fleet was thrown into disarray. Without their flagship, the Ythrak forces faltered, their coordination crumbled, and within minutes the remaining warships began to retreat. For the first time in years, the Ythrak were on the run. Captain Monroe felt the weight of what had just happened. The crew erupted into cheers, but Monroe's thoughts were already on the next step. They had done it. They had struck the Ythrak at their core and forced them to retreat. But this was only the beginning. The war was far from over, but the victory sent a message to the galaxy that the Ythrak Empire could be toppled, that humanity was not just a force to be reckoned with, but a catalyst for the resistance of all oppressed species throughout the galaxy. As the Resolute began to regroup and prepare for the next phase, Monroe felt a renewed sense of hope. Humanity was no longer a solitary species fighting for survival. They were part of something bigger, a united front of resistance that would challenge the might of the Ythrak Empire. And with every victory, they would take one step closer to freedom. The crew of the Resolute had proven that no matter the odds, humanity would never back down. They would fight, and they would win.